brown synthetic fur, round little ears, and black buttons for eyes. I knew him as well as I knew my own face, my own name. He had been in my life for as long as I could remember. In fact, one of my earliest memories was watching my mom hold him by one of his little paws, dangling him at a careful distance from herself, as if she held something dangerous or revolting, or both. His name was Mr. Abad, but sometimes we called him the teddy bear, because that was what he looked like. A simple little teddy bear, one that had been so well loved that the stuffing spilled out of his rips across his body. Most of the time, he had no mouth. But sometimes, he smiled. We don't know where he came from. My dad said Mr. Abad had always been in his life, that his dad had gotten him from his grandfather, and his grandfather had gotten it from his great-grandfather, and so on. His family speculated about deals made with the devil, stolen, cursed objects that haunted their thieves, or a child's ghost that haunted their favorite stuffed toy. But honestly, no one knew the truth. No one could speak to Mr. Abad's origins, if he even had any. We passed Mr. Abad to each other every 3 weeks. No more, no less. My dad would pass it to my mom would pass it to me to my sister, and then she'd hand it off to Aunt Linda. Aunt Linda's family would pass it around themselves, and then to our other relatives. Mr. Abad slowly made his way back to us. He always came back. Always. When I was young, I didn't have to take my turn holding Mr. Abad, so I took that peace and safety for granted. I don't anymore. Mr. Abad brings bad luck. That's the only way I can describe it. You might be laughing right now, or skeptical, because bad luck doesn't sound like such a big deal. Maybe it's not when you only have a little bit of it here or there. But when bad luck is in your life for 3 straight weeks, each week stretching out into the horizon before you, like a road to hell, it feels like an eternity. It feels like drowning at the bottom of a deep well. We weren't allowed to let go of Mr. Abad, not until it was time to pass him off to someone else. My dad told us that. He showed my sister Anna and me the scars on his leg, and talked about the time he forgot to keep touching Mr. Abad. Dad only forgotten a couple of minutes, but Mr. Abad hurt him anyway. My dad had a permanent limp because of it. The first week, it would start off small. If I didn't have Mr. Abad in my arms, I wouldn't have even thought it was necessarily bad luck. I would lose my favorite pair of socks or forget a homework assignment. Maybe I'd accidentally knock over something valuable or expensive. Somehow I'd run into previous open doors and jam my fingers when a window slammed shut on them. It was a week full of minor injuries. It's like being the target of some petulant toddler's scorn and whimsy. Inconvenient, yes, but hardly life-threatening. The second week, things would ramp up. Someone would steal my bike or knock my phone out of my hands. If that happened, I knew I'd never find my bike or phone again. At least, not on this side of the grave. But most importantly, during the second week of bad luck, I couldn't cross any streets. Because anytime I tried, a car would barrel straight at me from some street that had been empty scant seconds before. And when that would happen, I would only barely make it back on the sidewalk. So I stopped walking to school during my second week of holding Mr. Abad. My mom drove me, even though my school was only 2 minutes away by car. The third week was the worst week of all, because that was when Mr. Abad stopped playing and started trying to hurt us in earnest. I remember the time that I, against my parents' warnings, ventured out to grab some candy bars and magazines. Mr. Abad was with me, of course. He rode my backpack, and his head poked out of the unzipped top. On my way to the nearest 7-Eleven, a route that I had walked countless times, someone dragged me into an alleyway, one that I'd never noticed before. He wore a mask that only had holes for his eyes and nose. I couldn't tell what he looked like under it. Whoever he was, he beat me badly. He even broke 3 fingers on my right hand. Then he took everything except Mr. Abad and left me for dead. I've just the briefest memory of that time. What I remember is choking on my own blood, barely able to breathe, my arms screaming in pain. I remember turning my head and seeing Mr. Abad sitting right by my face. and as I watched, he smiled at me with a small, sly smile, his black eyes gleaming with pleasure and satisfaction. I looked into those eyes, and I knew that he would do unspeakable things to me before I died. But I didn't die. My parents grew worried for me and called my phone. When I didn't pick up, because by then my phone had been stolen, they went out in search of me. Hannah told me that my dad had been the one to drive me to the hospital because my mom had hysterics when she saw me. After that, my parents instituted a new rule. My sister and I weren't allowed to leave the house if it was our third week holding Mr. Abad. I was thankful for that rule because I didn't want to think about what would happen if my parents hadn't found me. Even when confined to our house, bad luck dogged my footsteps. Of course it did. I couldn't go outside, but I still held Mr. Abad. One time, I stumbled over nothing and fell down the stairs, fracturing my knee. Another time, I dropped some dishes while washing them, and their broken shards flew straight towards my eyes. I managed to turn my head aside at the last moment, but they still sliced my face open, leaving a deep cut from my left eye down to my chin. The cut became infected. My parents were too scared to take me to the ED. I mean, what if we got into a car crash on the way there? What if the nurses made me let go of Mr. Abad? We ended up asking our family doctor to do a home visit. Another time, once again during my third week of bad luck, I tried to cook dinner, and I set the kitchen on fire. It was only my sister's quick thinking that saved us from burning alive. Eventually, when it was my third week of holding Mr. Abad, I just stayed in my room. I would lie on my bed staring up at the ceiling, feeling his soft, warm, repulsive body wriggling against my side. I'd stay there, completely still, trying not to think. Like I said, I don't take safety for granted anymore. 2 years after I first started taking my turn with Mr. Abad, Aunt Linda ran away. She packed up her kids, took nothing but the clothes on their family's back, and left no note. Her extremely puzzled neighbors were the ones who notified us that she'd disappeared. We knew why she'd left. My parents, more generous than me, made excuse after excuse for her. With such a big family, kids so young, it's hard. It must be exhausting taking care of everyone all by herself, without a husband, my mom said. I said nothing because I didn't trust my own voice. What I wanted to do was track Linda down and punch her, beat her until her face turned lumpy and misshapen. I mean, how dare she run away from her responsibilities to Mr. Abad? How dare she leave us like this? But all my rage just masked what I really felt, which was jealousy. A tiny voice inside of me said, I wish that was me. I wish I could run away. Yet even then, none of us had any idea how much worse Mr. Abad could get. We passed him around from person to person because doing so somehow distilled the bad luck that he brought to each person by themselves. But with Linda and her family gone, that was 5 less people to share the bad luck to thin it down for each other. 5 less people standing between us and his twisted games. When I turned 16 years old, Anna died. I still blame myself even now. At the time she breathed her last, I was at school, completely unaware that anything was wrong. Because of my frequent absences, I kept having to do remedial classes to try to catch up with kids who were much younger than me. While she screamed and cried and begged for mercy, I doodled in my notebook and thought about how boring math class was. First thing I saw as I walked into the cul-de-sac where our house stood was the ambulance in our driveway. The lights were on, flashing red and blue around us, but sunlight diminished the effect somewhat. The second thing I saw was my mom standing outside of our house, looking small and defeated. And the final thing I saw was that none of our neighbors came to offer us any sympathy or words of comfort. They stood outside in their front yards. They stared out of their living room windows. They wouldn't come near us. I noticed this before. That time I'd been mugged. I screamed until I nearly dislocated my jaw, but no one came to help me. My teachers were all the same. They should have been concerned that I kept showing up with injuries and that I was failing almost all of my classes, but they weren't. It was as though my family lived inside our own circle of hell, and on some level, everyone knew we were cursed. So they stayed away from us. And they didn't notice when we needed help. "Mom," I said, out of breath because I'd run the whole way to our house. "Mom, what happened?" For a moment, I didn't think she had heard me. She stared off into the distance, her eyes blank and shiny like black buttons. Finally, she said slowly, "It's Anna. We're not sure what happened, we think. She let go of the bear." If she said more, I couldn't hear her over the rushing sound in my ears. Horror choked my throat. I wanted to ask if Anna was okay. Was my sister all right? But I knew the answer without her even telling me. I turned and I ran into the house, somehow convinced that this was a mistake, that Anna would be just inside doing her homework or watching TV, and if that was the case, I wouldn't even be angry at her. I would just give her a hug and I would tell her how worried she had made us. I ran past photographs of the four of us, all of us smiling and looking at the camera as if we didn't have a care in the world, as if we weren't cursed by bad luck. I checked all the bedrooms first, but I ran back downstairs and checked the living room, my dad's study. Everything looked normal, untouched. Until I reached the kitchen. I stopped for 1 full minute. I just stopped. I stopped moving. Stopped even breathing because I could see the blood everywhere. And the knives. So many knives scattered all across the kitchen, nearly every one a different size. There were the huge knives you used for butchering and the small knives used for peeling fruit, steak knives, knives with serrated edges, knives with smooth ones. They stuck into the floors, into the walls. Some even hung from the ceiling as if some great force flung them upwards. Blood trailed from the knives and pooled on the floor. I didn't know that anyone, any human, could hold that much blood inside of them. In the middle of all those knives, I saw the shape of my sister, but they'd had to pull the knives out of the floor and out of her body so that they could take her to the ambulance. And of course, sitting on the floor next to all the knives, his little brown fur somehow untouched by all of that deep, red blood. Mr. Abad smiled at me. Things changed after that. And of course they did. Anna was everyone's favorite. Yeah, I can admit that. It would have been easy to hate her for being clever and brave and beautiful, except she was kind to everyone. Sometimes I thought that we'd been born in the wrong order, that Anna was really my older sister and I was the younger one. And don't get me wrong, we had our petty sibling rivalries, fights about whose turn it was to take out the trash, who was taking too long in the shower, but she was my sister and I loved her. My dad blamed my mom for what had happened. He had been at work and my mom had been responsible for watching Anna and Mr. Abad. We all knew what happened was really Mr. Abad's fault. But Dad needed someone to blame. And my mom simply took his anger, his shouting, his insults. Instead of defending herself, she hung her head. And she began to drink. Gin and tonics in the morning, a few glasses of wine in the afternoon. Whiskey and vodka at night. Our living room became a makeshift dumpster. I would come home from school to find empty bottles all around her, 2 feet deep in some places. Mom was a pale ghost that sat in front of the TV all day and night, unmoving. Sometimes I wondered how much my mom regretted her decision to marry Dad, to marry into all this madness. It wasn't a question of if, it was a question of how much. Dad said he'd told her about Mr. Abed before they married, but she might not have believed him. I mean, who would? I knew that if she could run away, if she could have unspooled time to back when she met Dad, she wouldn't have made the same choices. She loved Anna and me, but she wouldn't have married him. 3 weeks after Anna died, Mr. Abed came back. He had disappeared from the kitchen, and we knew that he hadn't gone to any of Dad's brothers. So we had thought maybe, just maybe, he left. It's hard for me to write this because even now I feel ashamed, but truth is truth. Selfishly, a part of me hoped that Anna's death had been enough for Mr. Abed, that he wouldn't return to hurt us anymore because he had gotten what he wanted. But he came back. He always comes back. The day Mr. Abed came back, my dad and I were the ones to find him. He sat on our doorstep, his eyes twinkling merrily, as if only he knew the punchline to this joke. I saw the look on Dad's face as he picked Mr. Abed up, and I was afraid. His eyes didn't look rational. Not at all. His eyes belonged in the face of some wild animal driven to the brink of madness. Some animal that had been forced to gnaw its right paw off to escape the trap. I tried to take Mr. Abed from Dad, but he wouldn't let me. He tucked Mr. Abed under his left arm. He walked towards the kitchen. The blood had been wiped clean. Everything had been set back in order, but we all avoided being in the kitchen as much as possible. Takeout overfilled our trash cans, and there was an unpleasant smell from the fridge because none of us had cleaned it or even opened it. My dad strode over to the switch by the sink, turned on the trash disposal. I knew what he planned to do, and I ran in front of him, trying to block him off with my body. I might as well have tried to stop a semi-truck from running me down. Dad pushed me aside so hard that I banged my head against the wall and tears came into my eyes. Dad leaned over the sink and started to lower Mr. Abed. I saw Mr. Abed's face right before he disappeared into the drain. He smiled at me. Dad, no! I knew it was going to happen. It was like being trapped in a nightmare. When you know that you need to run to move, but you can't move quickly no matter how hard you try. I reached out for my dad. I wanted to pull him back from the sink before it was too late. I reached out with a hand that seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. Dad slipped on something. It shouldn't have happened. There was no logical reason for it to have happened, but it did. First his hand, then his entire arm disappeared down the sink. Into that hungry black drain, tufts of brown fur flew into the air, into our faces, then blood. It must have taken a few seconds for the pain to truly hit, but my dad was silent at first. And then he screamed. A high, piercing shriek that was pure agony. The cords of his neck stood out, his face turned into a ghoulish mask, lips drawn down and eyes bulging with horror. Finally, I was able to move normally again. Finally, I was able to sprint to that switch to slap it down frantically. Only a minute, maybe a minute and a half had elapsed, but that was enough. My dad staggered backwards, his injured arm held out. Except arm wasn't the right word to describe it anymore. It had lost its shape. There were no fingers, nothing that looked remotely like a human arm. Blood squirted out from everywhere that the hand had been. From his shoulder down, only tatters of flesh clung to the bone, some of them held together by the tiniest, thinnest layer of skin. I caught glimpses of pale white bone peeking out of all that shredded skin. I called 911. My voice was as hoarse as if I had been the one screaming, "Send help, please send help, it's my dad." Dad slid down the counter slowly, his legs collapsing underneath him like he was too tired to stand anymore. I thought, there's blood all over the kitchen again. They'll never get it out. His blood was on me too. I could feel it on my face like warm rain. That sweet metallic smell that so distinctly the scent of blood filled the air. My mom came running to us from the living room. Dad's screams had woken her from her stupor. She slid on the blood, scrambling back up, slid back down again. She didn't even seem to notice. Her gaze remained fixed on the man that she had been married to for the last 2 decades. We both knew he was dying. He was losing too much blood, his face was turning gray. The paramedics would never make it in time. Mom slipped and slid her way to Dad's side. She tried to pick him up, but he was too heavy, slippery with blood, so the best she could manage was to rest just part of his head in her lap. "John," she said. "John, it's okay. You're gonna be okay." Dad didn't look at her. I don't think he even knew she was there. He looked at me. He just said, "Anna, is it?" And he died. I watched the light steal out of his eyes. I watched his chest slowly stop moving. I watched my dad die. And as I sat there in his cooling blood, listening to Mom sob as if her heart would fall out of her chest and shatter into pieces, I knew something. I knew that Mr. Abad would never, ever leave us alone. Not unless we killed him first. I mean, he wanted us to suffer, yes, but he wanted us to die even more, so we had to do something. I walked over to the sink, I looked down, and I saw what I knew I would see. Mr. Abad staring back up at me with a smile on his face. He had emerged from the garbage disposal, miraculously whole. Even his fur looked perfect again. Shoving him down the garbage disposal hadn't worked. And that time Anna and I had nearly burned to death, I'd seen Mr. Abad staring at us with his black button eyes, utterly untouched by the flames. What could I do? "Mom?" I shook her shoulder. She looked at me, and I started crying too, crying so hard I could barely talk. "Mom, we need to do something." She shook her head, not understanding. "We need to do something about him." I swallowed. "Does Uncle Miles still have his boat stored in Harbor Cove?" Even with the motorboat, it took me 4 days to arrive at a part of the ocean that was deep enough for what I had planned to do. I didn't need to cross the Atlantic Ocean or pilot this boat to the Mariana Trench. I just needed somewhere that wouldn't be easily disturbed, somewhere quiet, and cold, and dark. All the old tales say salt, iron, and rowan would help protect you. I was hoping that the old tales were right because I was about to plunge Mr. Abad into a shit ton of salt. I cut the engine. I let the boat drift a bit. The boat rocking under my feet was smooth. It was peaceful. But I couldn't enjoy it because I was too worried about what Mr. Abad would do to me when he figured out why we're here. I took a deep breath as I slid my backpack off my shoulders, and then, in one quick motion, I tore Mr. Abad out of the backpack. I expected to see him smiling at me. And I was right. Even so, I flinched because it wasn't the small smile he showed me before when my sister and my dad died. No, this was a huge smile that ate up his entire face. He was literally smiling from cheek to cheek. I half expected that wide smile to open to reveal huge teeth, for him to laugh aloud. An ominous crack resounded. I whipped my head around and saw with a flash of terror that my boat had sprung a leak. Water bubbled out of it, spurting down to where I stood. For a moment, I thought about giving up. While just navigating my way back to Harbor Cove with Mr. Abad tucked safely under my arm. And then something spoke up. Something had seethed in silence for years. Something that had been inside of me ever since I first saw my mom holding Mr. Abad. That voice said, no. He doesn't get to win. I thought about the knives in the ceiling and the look in my dad's face when he called me Anna. I thought about the sound of my mom crying as if her heart had broken, and that moment when I choked on my own blood and known that I was going to die. And suddenly all that anxiety and that fear crystallized into a rage so immense I could barely breathe. That rage drove out everything in my head, every thought and worry, and left only the overwhelming desire to finish this. "Fuck you," I screamed at Mr. Abad. "You're not going to win this time." Maybe I was going to die today. Maybe my boat would pull me down with it when it sank, and I would drown slowly and painfully, but Mr. Abad wasn't going to win. My mom was still alive, and if I had my way, she'd stay alive for another 20 years, another 30 or 40. I knelt down, and with shaking fingers, I dug into my backpack for the last few items I'd brought with me. 2 giant red bricks, a fragment of iron, and some heavy-duty twine. The boat began to list alarmingly to one side, but I slapped Mr. Abed against the iron and the red bricks, and I kept tying one knot after another, my shoulders tense. And then it was done. The final knot tied. I staggered to my feet, one hand on the railing, the other still holding Mr. Abed. His face had changed. He no longer smiled at me. Instead, he snarled angrily at me, his huge teeth sharpening into fangs, his black button eyes beginning to multiply across his face. I threw him into the ocean. I tried to watch him sink, to make sure that he sank, but the dark blue depths swallowed him almost instantly. My boat continued to tremble underneath me, not from the movement of the waves this time, or at least not solely from it, but because it was shaking. I didn't even care. I waited for some pithy one-liner to come to my head. Waited to feel something other than a deep numbness, but all that I could think about was the look in my dad's eyes when he held Mr. Abed over the sink. Please let it be over. Please, God, let it be over. For the first time in my life, I was lucky. When my boat sank, another boat happened to me nearby, and they noticed that I was clinging onto the wreckage. They brought me back home, safe. It's been 13 years since that day. 13 years filled with joy and with love. When Mr. Abed disappeared into those briny depths, it was like some great shadow lifted from our lives. I know Mom feels the same way. It was harder for her, harder to start living without fear again because she'd gotten so used to Mr. Abed as a permanent fixture in our lives. And what about me? Well, my grades shot up once I didn't have to worry constantly about being maimed or dying. I went to college, something I had once thought about as an impossible dream. I met someone, something else I'd never thought would happen. His name's Benjamin. We married each other 5 years ago. He asked if I wanted a beach wedding, and I told him that I have crippling thalassophobia, so we got married inside a small chapel. My mom walked me down the aisle, even though by then she'd had to use a cane. Too many old injuries from all those years with Mr. Abed. Even now we talk about moving her to an assisted living home, somewhere safe, where there are people to help her. Ben and I have a daughter named Annabelle, named after my sister. I look into her face and I see my dad's eyes. I never go a day without missing Dad and Anna. It's my only regret, that they died before they could meet my daughter. I find myself constantly wondering what they would have said, how my dad would have been his grandparent. I think about what words of wisdom he might have passed down to my daughter, words that she'll never know. But why am I telling all of this now? Why am I telling you this when it's 13 years since I threw Mr. Abed into the ocean? 13 years since my dad and Anna died. Because this morning, as I sat at our kitchen table and drank my coffee, I saw the following headline. Family swallowed by Florida sinkhole, feared dead. The article included a photo of the family. Years had changed their faces slightly, but I still recognized them. Aunt Linda, her kids clustered around her, hugging each other, laughing. I sat there, the coffee going cold, the newspaper clenched tightly in my fists. I sat there, and I was afraid. I don't know how long I would have stayed there, staring at the photos of my dead relatives, but just then my daughter raced into the kitchen, nearly colliding with one of the kitchen chairs. Mommy, Mommy, come take a look! Annabelle tugged my hand, my face glowing with pleasure. Instantly, that fear faded away, and all I could feel was love for her. What is it, honey? Look, look, look! I stood up, allowing her to lead me. We went to the front door, and Annabelle stood there on her tiptoes, trying to reach the doorknob. She was so beautiful, so perfect. It was hard to believe that someday she'd be all grown up. Finally, she got the door open and she pointed. "Look at the teddy bear! It's smiling!" Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and thank you for watching tonight's video, or listening to tonight's podcast, and thank you for clicking the thumbs up, the subscribe, the follow, the bell, the whatever helpful thing there is on such a platform. If you want to find your nice Halloween horror audiobook to listen to this year, check out audible.com and look for MrCreepyPasta, because I got a whole bunch of books over there, books like Tales from the Gas Station. And as always, I want to give a very big thank you to everybody who is supporting me on Patreon. If you guys have been supporting me on Patreon, or if you're considering doing so, then know that I just added in a couple of cool things for the loyalty program because I found out that I could. I had no idea that I could do that. So now, you guys should be getting some cool things in the mail brought to you by Patreon that are pretty cool. They support the channel as well. Oh, getting to the point though, a huge thank you to patrons such as Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Bryon Arce, Bobby Karman, Stephanie Butler, Tristain Pelton, Chance Burnett, Diana Kraus, William King, Heather McDonald, Reaper 61167, Alex the Sandwich, Darth Miver, Michael Ortiz, Satanic Aries, Ness 69420, aisodoehtraed with 2 exclamation points, Nessie, Ronny Hansen, Bardohawk 764, Melancholy Corpse, Ferb, Harley, Billy Morrow, Madam Skullbunny, Sashi Suzaku, Grizzly Olsen.pro, Caden the Spooky Boy, Zane Nightshade, My Body Sounds Like Rice Krispies, Ashwood, Lord of the Weebs, Jay, Miss Exandra, Mr. Unsettling Spaghetti, Suji Campbell, Stricken, Azarine Fox, Fried Chicken 12, Freddy Krueger, Pie Nanny, Michael Scarborough, Infernal One, Lisa Cottrell, Caspian, Jordan Nels, Hades Nephew, Tater Chip, Acid System, Prozac and Pancake Appreciation Society, Cryptic Nightmares, Kiri the Sloth, Tommy Green, Fester's Lampshade, Sky Harbor, Nina Smith, Nico Cayo, Rafael Rodriguez, The Ginger Bros, Aaron Stormcrow, Daniel Polson, Trace Miles, and Corey Kenshin. Thank you guys so much, so much for being a part of the Patreon and helping me keep the lights on and helping me get exclusive stories and everything that we do on the channel here. Thank you guys so much for being a part of it. Thank everybody in the description, and thank you guys who have stayed to this part of the video. It really means so much to me. I hope you all have a very happy Halloween, and sweet dreams.